Hello, I'm John Cole Morgan. I run a very small quilt shop here in Tring in Hertfordshire. Some of you may know me from TV shows like Kirsty Allsop's Handmade Christmas, when I did a TV show with Kay Fassett of all people on Channel 5, or you may have seen me as a Sewing Street presenter back at the early days of COVID. Either way, I am a very enthusiastic quilter. I'm a huge fan of Vlieseline products. I always use their waddings, their stabilizers, their quilter's grid, their quick screen, all of their products. I love them, I love them, I love them. So this year, when Vlieseline were looking for somebody to do their quilt-along, Mystery Quilt-a-Long as well, I was so proud to be able to be asked and accepted when they submitted my design, and we are going to embark on a mystery quilt project together over the next few weeks. Some of the weeks we're going to be using Quilter's Grid, which is the most fantastic product you may or may not have used before, Vlieseline's, and if you haven't used it before, give it a go. Some shops around the country will be selling kits. If you want to do that, by all means, search it out on social media. You'll be able to find them. I know my tiny little shop will be selling kits, and we'll be having Vlieseline Quilter's Grid included in the kit for you to have a go. So this is a really simple, beginner-friendly project in order to take part in different sizes. You can do the massive size with the 5-inch. If you want to be really ambitious and do 6 inches, you can do that. Otherwise, you can be really cautious, and you can do the 1-inch blocks. Either way, using the Vlieseline Quilter's Grid is why we've decided to take this mystery project together, and I hope you'll join us along for the ride. Thank you, and good luck. When people come to choose their colours for any sort of mystery quilt-along, I always hate not knowing how it's going to turn out. I'm a bit nervous about trusting the process, but what I thought was really important was to show you what colours I'd used and how they all went together. Now I think you can see that you've got 6 colours here that obviously are very similar to 6 colours in there. And what we're doing is we're just trying to get a softer colourway to go with it. And these are the main blocks, so these are the main colours, and then you've got these wonderful little accent colours to go with it. So that is how I've chosen the colours for this quilt-along. So that is what we are doing, and now we're going to start cutting them all up. So I've cut my width of fabrics here, 5 inches, and as you can see, this one's decided to move along. Now, if you are going to cut precariously, please make sure you do it safely. Your hands are important, so be safe. Don't do that. So what I've got there is my 4 widths of fabric, and then you're going to trim off. I'm going to do this much easier. I feel comfortable cutting 4 layers of fabric at once. If you don't. You must just do what you feel safe with. But what I always do is I line the top up with a line on my cutting board. And because I know I need to cut my salvages off here, I always dangle my salvages over here. You can come closer and see you can see my 0 line is over there. So I line my 0 line up over here, making sure you're not going to cut your cameraman, making sure you're far away from your blade and not going to cut yourself. And you get rid of that. So you've got your dead line over there for your 5 inches. Line your ruler up the 5 inches. I always line that one up and this one as close as I can, and then you cut your 5-inch squares accordingly. Now, if you don't want to make the quilt 5-inch squares, which will be quite a reasonably large size quilt, you are most welcome to cut it smaller. It is your call. The great thing about this quilt is I've done it in multiples of whole inches. So if you want to do a 3-inch quilt to make a lap quilt or a cot quilt, that would actually be absolutely fine. So you just adjust the pattern measurements by your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-inch squares as you want to do it. Now, the other way you can do this, if you don't want to move your fabric, is you move your board. Different people do different things. Do what is right for you and what is safe for you. So you can see here, I'm doing exactly as I did before, lining up my 5 inches on this line here, and I'm cutting my 5-inch squares along the way. Again, making sure you're doing what is safe for you. Now, as you'll see there, I did what many of us do, is I veered off. So you can see I've got a couple of little strands like this, so I know that these squares are going to be the wrong size. So what I do with this is I take this and I drag it over my ruler like that. I line it up, and the reason I do that is I then move my ruler over and I line my 5-inch square. You can see my cut line is here. I line my 5-inch mark over there, and I check all the way along here that my 5 inches lined up. And you can see over here the excess that I've cut off is not a problem. And all I do now, because the bottom 3 are lined up, I do that. But before I carry on, I take these and I line them up here. And I measure my 5-inch square. It's better if you use one of those square ones, but you can see I've lined up here, I've lined up there, and all I do is I trim off that funny little excess bit over here, and now your squares are completely lined up. You will have that happen. It is not a problem. Do not feel bad about it. Everybody does it. Now, when you're doing your cutting, you'll notice that some of the colors you actually cut the same amount of squares. So with the 2 pinks, these are the same amount of squares. And for the green, it's the same amount of squares. So I like cutting different layers of fabric, I don't like the whole cutting process. I like to do it as quickly as possible. You may be completely different and you may want to do it individually. That is entirely your choice. Please do whatever is comfortable for you and what you feel most safe doing. I normally cut 4 layers in one go, but I'm not going to risk doing too many layers. So what I've done here is I've done 3 colors in a way, and I'm just lining these all up, ready to go. When you do multiple layers, it does pay you to just take your time and make sure everything's, as you can see, beautifully pressed and you've not had any creases or anything on it. You know, you're much better quilters than I am. And for these 3 colors, we're going to be cutting 16 squares. So you're going to be cutting 2 5-inch strips of each one. As you know, I'm making 2 of these quilts, so I'm going to have a little bit more. And what you do is you cut your 10-inch mark and we go from there. So at this point, to make my life easier, and I'm going to cut off my salvages now. And from here, I'm going to cut my 5-inch strips. And these are just width of fabric, 5-inch strips. For each of the colors, the pink, the green, and the light pink, you need 8 5-inch strips. Brand new blade will make your life a lot easier in this process. And I'm just getting rid of my extra fabric at that point. So at this point, you now can decide how you're going to cut these. I'm going to do it the safe way, and I'm going to rotate all of the fabric in line. And as I show you, we'll line everything up with the 0 line over here. And I always try and line the top of the fabric up with a marking on my cutting board, just to make sure I've got it on as square as I can possibly get it. And at this point, we line our ruler up with a 5-inch mark on the edge here, and the 5-inch mark on our mat to check everything's lined up. And off we go. And that is 3 of our colors cut. You got your bright pink, your light pink, and your green. So for this blue, these are all your cornerstones in the project. So you're going to cut out a few more of these in order to have your cornerstones. So you're going to set 9 of these to one side per quilt for your cornerstones, and the rest of them will be, if I'm not mistaken, it's 16 of them. You will then put those together for your blocks. And this is the one you need the most fabric for of the colors. I think the black is obviously you need bigger borders and stuff, but for the black or whatever color background you're choosing to use, but this is the one that's got the most for your piecing. And when you have cut, check that you've got all the salvages, because like that, you may end up in a situation where you haven't caught all the salvages. So that is a good trick to check you've caught them all. If you haven't caught them all, oh, both of them are gone, that's absolutely fine. So you'll see all I'm doing now is where I did line that up to the 0 line. I'm just hanging that over the edge now, so these selvages will then be cut off when I do my initial line. And by doing that, you'll see I've got all this leftover bit on the edge here. So by recognizing that the selvage is out, you don't need to recut fabric. And there's quite a lot left over here anyway. And then you're cutting your 5-inch squares accordingly. And then because the selvage is hanging over the edge here, when you line this up with your 0 line, hopefully all that additional selvage that you've got is gone. And it is. And you've got all your squares ready to go, including your cornerstones. Now you can take 9 of the cornerstones out now if you choose to. I personally prefer to leave them all in the bundle because I know where they all are. You do what works best for you. Now when you do the beautiful maroon, you're going to need 26 5-inch squares for the blocks, and then you're going to need 6 5 3/8 squares for the triangles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my squares first, so you know how we're doing those. We've done them all before. We've done that exactly like we've done before for the other ones. We're just going to cut our 5-inch squares. So at that point, we've now cut all of the maroon squares, but now we've got the maroon triangles to go as well. Now, the one thing I will say to you is when you cut your triangles, you've got to be very careful of the bias that you create along the long diagonal. I personally like to put them in a Ziploc bag and never touch them again until you're about to sew them, because it is very, very easy to stretch your fabric without intending to, and I try very hard not to do that. Now, as you've seen, I'm cutting off the bolt. You'll see on the edges here, the fabric moves along and you never quite get it right. So I always hang it over the edge to make sure I get a clean line at the beginning. And because we are cutting triangles, you're going to be cutting 5 3/8. Now, you will see in a few moments, I will do a little tutorial on how to get to 5 3/8. But at the moment, we're just going to trust that I've got 5 3/8 and I'm cutting a strip 5 3/8. And I'm going to cut 2 strips of 5 3/8. And when we've cut the 2 strips, we're going to do some cheat cutting again, because I like to do these things really quickly. And we can then make it work. So as we all know, that is a whole number. So we're going to just work with that square there. So we're going to do that is 1, that is 1, and that is 0. Okay, so we all know a whole, but then when we look at it, we've got a half. So that is half over there. And I think most of us understand that very, very comfortably. And then, of course, because we're quilters, you've got a 1/4 inch here, and you've got a 1/4 inch there. As you can see, I can't draw very well. So a 1/4 there and a 1/4 there. And then you've got a half, and you've got a half, and then you've got 3/4, and you've got 3/4. As you can tell, my drawing skills have much to be desired. So the great thing about that is I think we all get that. That's a 1/4, that's a half, that's 3/4, that's whole. But the gaps in between 0 and a 1/4, that's called an 1/8. So I find that really annoying, but anyway, that's 1/8. But that means, because if we could do this as an 8, so that's going to be 8, that's going to be 6, that's going to be 4, that's going to be 2. So you've got 2, 4, 6, 8 to make your whole, which means that's going to be 1, 3, 5, and 7. And that's these tiny little lines in between your 1/4, half, 3/4, and whole. So when it says 3/8, what you're going to do is you're going to go, you've got a half, you've got a 1/4, which is 2, and you've got a half, which is 4. So it's this little line in between. So when I say it's 5 3/8, you're going to go down to, if we just move down a little bit, you've got 5, and then you've got 1, 2, 3. So that is 5 3/8 on your ruler over there. That's 5 1/2, that's 5 1/4. It's the little gap in between. So all I'm doing now, because I feel comfortable cutting 4 layers of fabric in one go, you can see I'm moving my selvages to be on top of each other. I'm lining them up, and I'm making sure that I've got all my fabric lined up as close to the edge as I can. That feels about right. And I'm going to use my square for this. As you'll see, we've just discussed how you get your 5 3/8. Now at this point, you're going nowhere near the cameraman when you try and cut your first little strip there, and you cut your selvage. So what I'm going to do now is, as I showed you in that little video, there is our 5 3/8 line there, and I'm lining that up all the way along here, and you're checking 5 3/8 and 5 3/8 over here, and you can see that that is pretty accurate. And then what I'm doing is I'm cutting like that. Now, what I find really easy is if I take this and I grab the fabric on this end, I just gently pull that away, I leave this as it is, and then I get a bigger ruler. I'm not moving this at all. And because we're making triangles, I know that I've got to cut across one long diagonal. I'm going to cut from there to there while holding this as tight as I can. And then you can see you've got 4 8 triangles that you're going to need later on. Now with these, I always try and keep them there. I never grab this end because this has got bias. I always grab on this end, and I make sure that wherever I put them, I never have to move them until I have to cut them. So what we're doing now is we have got our border fabric, our background fabric for our sashing pieces. So what I'm going to do here is I'm quite simply just making a nice straight edge over here. You will see, per the cutting requirements, you need to cut 12 32 by 5-inch strips for your sashing strips. Now I'm cutting directly off the bolt. I've got 2 bolts of the fabric, so I've got one on top of the other, and I am just cutting 5-inch strips, which are width of fabric, and I'm just going all the way through and trimming them down. Because they only need to be 32 inches, you're obviously going to have some leftover bits at the top of your fabric, which if you've been very lucky and your fabric is 4 inches wide, you'll be able to get a couple of 5-inch squares out, which you're going to need in the quilt for some of your piecing blocks. So what I've done here is we're at 5 strips. I'm going to get 7 out of 1 cut, because obviously 7 times 5 is 35, and my board goes to 36 inches. And the last cut I've got here, so that's going to give me 7 5-inch strips. You only need 12, so you won't need that many more. I'm folding this back just so I've got the clarity as to where the end is. And just like I've done in the ones before, I'm going to cut the salvage pieces off as I go along, and we can go and we can check that we got that all done. Because my ruler's not quite long enough, I can then slide that down and check I've got that all lined up ready to go. So all of these pieces here beneath the ruler are going to be my sashing strip pieces. They need to be 32 inches by 5 inches, and there we go, ready to go. So obviously these need to be 32 inches long. So 32 divided by 2 is 16. So you can see I take my ruler down to 16 over here, line up my 16 on that line, line up my ruler over there. And what I'm going to do over here is trim this off. And if I've done this correctly, it doesn't always work out this way. You take your little ruler, you can see little dots of happiness. We've got our 5-inch squares. So over here we've got our 8 5-inch squares ready to cut for the next one. And you're going to need 12 of them. So the other part of this that you need to cut are your 5 3/8 squares. Now of course, because I've moved the fabric again, you haven't got it quite lined up, so you can see I'm going to cut it just past 5 1/2, and we're going to trim this down. Okay, so I've got there, and I'm leaving this because we've still got to do our outer borders. We'll come back to that. And what I'm going to do here is rotate this round. I've got this being completely flat and square and lined up. Take my ruler, line up 5 3/8 down the long side. You can see here 5 3/8, and I'm trimming this up over there. So what we do next, as we've done before, we're going to turn this. I'm going to fold the salvages directly on top of each other, and I'm going to take my little ruler and I'm going to line this up and get as much of that salvage off as possible without eating too much into the fabric. And you can see how close I got. If you want to get that extra 5 3/8 square out, you do need to go that close. So just like before, 5 3/8. And now you may get 8 out. If you don't get 8 out, that's okay. If you get 7, that's fine. If you're lucky, you get 8. Okay, and then this one, when you have got the fold, you're going to be a good quilter. You're going to go and press that nice and flat. You're not going to do what I'm doing over now. And you can see if you're lucky, you'll get 8 squares out of it like that. And that's all you're going to lose. But it doesn't always happen that way, so don't be upset. Now, if you have been a bad quilter like me and you haven't gone and pressed your fold out, make sure that you line this up beautifully. And by that, I mean you hold the piece of the fold down, you press that down there, and then you trim it, and you hope it doesn't move like it did there. And that's what you're looking to do. And you can see that that has come perfectly to the point. It's exactly what you need. And the last one here. Now, if like me, you are moving them around a little bit, just make sure that you haven't moved them around, that they're not completely aligned on top of each other, because if they are, your points may not match. So the dimensions you're looking to do is the sides over here. Now for myself, I'm doing them longer, wider, so they're going to be 77 by 6, which means that the bottom bit here will need to be a little bit longer than what the pattern says, and because I'm cutting at 6 inches, I need to add 2 inches to the length of the bottom and the top one, which will mean that my pieces that I'm cutting will be 6 inches wide by 88. The pattern will show you that you're doing 86 inches wide by 5, and the side ones over here you're doing 77 by 5. Those you're doing by just cutting 5-inch strips, sewing them together, but if you don't want to have the seams in it, you're welcome to then cut a 90-inch strip piece and then cut your dimensions, your borders out of that without having any seams in it as well. Your call entirely. And that, I think, brings us to the end of our cutting. So that is us cut out, ready to go, and we'll see you next week.